Danganronpa 2 is pure anime bullshit. The story is convoluted, characters quirky, their personalities defined by one interest, the gameplay mechanics seemingly chosen at random, but I'd be lying to you if I said that I didn't enjoy it from start to finish. Danganronpa 2 is a visual novel that begins with you waking up on an island where you're greeted by your teacher, Usami, a childish pink rabbit with magical powers. She tells you that you've been sent to this island for a school field trip, and that you won't be able to leave until you collect all the hope fragments by building relationships with your fellow classmates. Things inevitably go awry when Monokuma arrives and announces the start of the killing field trip. The setup for Danganronpa 2 is quite similar to the first game, where you're only allowed to leave the island if you kill someone, and no one finds out that you were the killer. Despite the fact that Danganronpa 2 is a sequel to the first game, you don't really need to play the first game to understand what's going on here. That being said, knowing the plot of the first game will be helpful, as it gives more context to some events closer to the end of the game, as well as giving context to some of the jokes the game makes regarding some of the worser qualities of the first game. When you wake up on the island, you'll be surrounded by 15 people who are your classmates, who you will get to know throughout your time on the island. Akane, the ultimate gymnast and perpetual glutton. Bikuya Tokami, the ultimate affluent progeny. Chiaki, the ultimate gamer and narcoleptic. Fuyuhiko, the ultimate yakuza and small boy. And Gundam, the ultimate breeder with his 4 devas of destruction. There's also Hyoko, whose whole personality is being a massive asshole. Ibuki, the ultimate musician and lol XD, so random girl. Kazuichi, the ultimate mechanic and the ultimate bro. Mahiru, the ultimate photographer and normal girl. Miken, the ultimate nurse and fan service dispenser. Nagito, the ultimate lucky student. Nekomaro, the ultimate team manager. Peko, the ultimate swordsman. Sanya, the ultimate princess, and finally, Taro, the only student who actually has 2 ultimates, the ultimate cook and the ultimate creep. Now, after going through all of the main cast, you might be wondering, wow, that's a lot of characters. How does the game manage to flesh all of them out? And the short answer is that it doesn't. Not really, at least, but before I can get to that, I've got a lot of ground to cover, because first, I have to talk about the gameplay. Danganronpa 2 consists of 4 gameplay states: story, investigation, free time, and trial. Story, investigation, and free time see you moving around the same island area that expands as you progress the story. You'll navigate these areas via a side-scroller level select hub area, point-and-click areas, as well as a few first-person environments. The game seems to choose whether to use point-and-click or first-person at random, although it does use first person really well at one point in the game that I won't spoil. Also, the side-scroller parts never stop feeling jarring, as they're the only part of the game that's separate from the trials that aren't in first person. So whenever I moved between areas, I felt like I'd started up a completely different game. Continuing on, the story section of the game are the parts between each of the other 3, where the game has you on rails running from place to place to read pieces of dialogue, and where major events like a murder occur. The next part of the game are the investigation sections, where you investigate a murder scene and talk to your other classmates to find evidence for the upcoming trial. There's not really much to be said about these. All you really do is point and click to find evidence until the game tells you you're good to go for the trial. It's not really that good, but it's not really anything bad either. Next off, we have free time. Free time consists of dating sim-like elements where you go around and spend time with other students and give them gifts. The scenes that play out when you hang out with your classmates honestly are mostly mediocre, only repeating information you could have already discerned from things you've learned during the main story, although some, like Chiaki's, are alright and flesh out the characters in meaningful ways. Something that's quite annoying, however, is that for some characters you have to complete their snelloshuss up to a certain point before some trials in the story, so if you're unlucky, you'll be locked out of some characters' free time events for the rest of your playthrough. For maxing out your relationship with a classmate, you get a questionable reward, as well as an ability you can use during trial sections, which range from being downright broken, like an ability that makes it so you don't lose time if you shoot white noise, to being rather useless, like removing all dummy panels and closing remarks. Finally, we have the most gameplay-driven part of the game. the actual trials themselves. Trials, as you probably could guess, is the part of the game where you deliberate with your classmates to figure out who the killer is. Trials consists of 5 minigames: Non-Stop Debate, Rebuttal Showdown, Improved Hangman's Gambit, Logic Dive, and Panic Talk Action. There will also be times where the game will ask you to present a piece of evidence to prove or counter a point someone is making, or to choose a response from a list of points. Non-Stop Debate is what I would call the core piece of the trial, as it's the minigame you'll spend the most time playing. It consists of a non-stop conversation where you have to shoot either a blue statement with a piece of evidence that supports it, or an orange statement with a piece of evidence that contradicts it, while avoiding shooting the words that fly in front. The biggest problem with this minigame isn't anything to do with the mechanics themselves, but instead with the solutions. The solutions are either needlessly obtuse or extremely simple. Sometimes the game will even go as far as to not let you present the most obvious piece of evidence to make the correct choice even more obtuse. I can't think of a single time while playing that I felt smart when I got the right answer. I also think that the flow of the gameplay could have been improved if there weren't transition animations whenever a non-stop debate started, as it would actually make them feel as if they were non-stopping. It also would have been cool if sometimes there were multiple strings of dialogue in a row, say you find one contradiction and then it jumps to a new conversation and you have to find another contradiction using the same set of bullets. Despite all the negative things I've said, I don't hate non-stop debates. In my opinion, the idea behind them is really cool, and I did feel a sense of satisfaction when I saw the zoom animation indicating I chose the right answer. I just wish they could have gone a bit further with the idea. Next off is Rebuttal Showdown, which I won't linger on for too long, as it's essentially just a better version of Non-Stop Debate, except with a sword instead of a gun. You essentially pick a piece of evidence to use as your sword and cut down what the other person is saying, and then use a piece of evidence to cut a contradiction when one shows up. Overall, it feels faster paced thanks to the active engagement from the player, as well as the fact that there wasn't a single time where the answer felt convoluted. It still has the problem that the answers are super easy, but I think it kind of works here thanks to its faster nature. Honestly, my favorite part of the trials. In stark contrast to Rebuttal Showdown, we have the worst part of the game, the improved Hangman's Gambit. It's basically a game of Hangman, except you choose your letters by guessing by shooting 2 of the same letters together and left-clicking, or you can get rid of those letters by right-clicking. Now you may be wondering why you'd want to get rid of a letter. Well, that's because if 2 letters collide, or you leave a combination of letters on the board for too long, they explode and you lose some influence. Influence is essentially just your health bar for the trial. You'll lose some whenever you make a mistake. This may not sound that bad on paper, but there can be a lot of letters on screen at once, especially when you don't have a solid strategy to deal with them at the start of the game. Couple in the fact that you lose some for wrong letter guesses, the fact that some answers could be worded in multiple ways, sometimes extra words are added onto obvious answers, it being really easy to misclick, and letters sometimes spawning in on top of each other make me dread every moment the words Hangman's Gambit showed up on my screen. I sincerely hope that I never have to play it again. Next off is probably the simplest game, Logic Dive. It's essentially just if you remember that browser game, except on a circular plane instead of a cube, and every so often you have to guess from a certain number of options regarding something that happened involving the murder. It was inoffensive, it was simple, it was fine. Moving on. Finally, we have Panic Talk Action, or PAC for short. PAC is essentially a rhythm game that occurs at the end of every trial when you have to shoot the shield surrounding someone by left-clicking in rhythm with the music, which speeds up or slows down as you hit or miss notes, respectively. As you hit notes, you build a fever bar that you can use by pressing space, which will make it so you don't lose your combo if you miss notes. The person you're accusing of being the murderer will also have a fever bar, however. However, theirs builds as you miss notes and will turn all notes invisible when active. After a few trials, they also add in a reload mechanic, where you have to press tab in time with the music to reload a clip of bullets once you run out. Once you've taken down all your opponent's shields, you have to spell out a counter-argument from 4 fragments. Honestly, PAC is the only minigame I didn't fully understand by the end of the game. Sometimes you'll hit notes, but a bullet won't be shot. Sometimes you'll have to shoot multiple words down before you can hit the shields. This may be a punishment for missing notes or just something that happens normally. I'm not sure, as it seemed to happen randomly. There's also the fact that hitting the notes just overall feels off, like they're slightly out of beat with the music. Still, I don't hate Pac like I do Hangman's Gambit. When it works and you got a good flow going, it feels great. But most of the time, it just feels slightly off. Now that I've gone through all the gameplay mechanics, you may have started to realize that there's a running theme between all of them. And that is that there is no running theme. There doesn't seem to be any cohesion between them at all. Like, they had a million ideas the developers wanted to do, but couldn't think of any way to build on most of them, so they just threw them all in and hoped no one would notice. Only a handful feel fleshed out enough to justify their inclusion. That's not to say game mechanics need to be complicated or engaging on their own to justify their existence. They can also exist to complement something else in the game, like the story. What Remains of Edith Finch and Virtue's Last Reward both do this amazingly. And Danganronpa 2 does do this a handful of times. And although they are eventful when they happen, they are the exception rather than the rule, as the only time I noticed that the game did this was with a mechanic that I didn't even mention up until this point because it's so small. When you are playing through the trial, there will sometimes be moments when you have to accuse someone of something. This could be as big as who is the murderer, to something smaller, like who manipulated something at the crime scene. This may seem like a small thing, but it actually works really well, as during the game you'll almost always know who you have to accuse in these moments, but you may really not want to. It creates this juxtaposition between what you want to do as a person and what you need to do to progress. And as cool as this is, the game doesn't do anything like this with its other mechanics. Like, maybe at some point during non-stop debates, you could have the choice to steer the debate away from a truth, not related to the murder, but that if it came out, would sour the relationship between two characters for the rest of the game. The game, however, doesn't do any of this, and it feels like a missed opportunity. And with that, I'm all done talking about gameplay. And I can now get back to the point I was going to make at the start of the review regarding how Danganronpa 2 handles characterization. The reason I had to go over gameplay first is that the problem stems from the trials themselves, as they almost always focus on only one character, the killer. You usually also learn some things about the victims, although they aren't present for the trial for, obvious reasons, so they don't get as much attention. This heavy focus on an individual character is somewhat positive, as it will flesh out the personalities of some characters, but it has one big flaw, and that's that the characters that survive until the end of the game aren't nearly as interesting or as well defined as the ones that died. Sure, this is supplemented somewhat with the free time events, as you can hang out with any character you want, but the problem with relying on the free time events for this is that you don't know who's going to be killed or is going to kill. So you might spend 3 free time slots hanging out with one character, only for them to be killed, which takes up time you could have spent with another character. This problem is exacerbated even further by the previously mentioned problem where if you don't hang out with some characters before certain trials, you get locked out of progressing the relationship, so you could waste multiple free time sessions hanging out with someone only to realize you can't progress at all. This can be quite frustrating, as I could easily see someone finishing the game and only having maxed out their friends with only 1 or maybe 2 characters, due to the size of the cast. I honestly think the best solution for this would have just been to cut out the free time events altogether, and instead build up more meaningful relationships over the story linearly, so the player doesn't feel cheated out of free time slots. Sure, it would make the game feel more linear, but I think the trade-off for more well-defined characters would be worth it. And I think that's as good as a segue as any other to talk about the story. I'm gonna be blunt here. I'm not the biggest fan of visual novels, which is a weird thing to say considering I usually steer clear of game genres I don't like, bar usually a handful of exceptions, but over the year I've played a good amount of visual novels. I've played the first 3 Phoenix Wright games and the Zero Escape trilogy, and I've enjoyed most of them. But every time I play one, they usually end up dragging on by the end, usually due to their lack of gameplay or the repetitive nature of the gameplay that's present. That's not to say that every game needs to be Dark Souls or anything like that. Beginner's Guide is one of my favorite games, and that game is almost entirely just walking. That being said, if you're leaning on the narrative, then that narrative better be good enough to carry itself on its own. So how is Danganronpa 2's? Is its narrative good enough to carry the game above its average gameplay? It's complicated. The game definitely has its peaks and valleys, and overall it kept me entertained from start to finish, but I'd struggle to call the story good. The story is divided up into 6 trials, and in order to explain why I do or don't like each one, I'm going to have to go into some light spoilers. Nothing drastic, like who the victims or killers were, but stuff that could hint towards who the killer is if you decide to play the game after watching this video. If you'd like to avoid this, skip to this point in the video. Alright, all good? Then let's get started. Trial 1 was the most predictable of all trials, and not because I was just super observant or anything, but because it was extremely obvious who'd done it from the moment the body was discovered, and that rings true for pretty much the whole trial. Although it's not the worst trial, better to be simple and make sense than to be ridiculous and make little sense, it did leave me anxious for what was to come. Thankfully, the next trial put my fears to rest. Trial 2 had a cool introduction from Monokuma that introduced the motive for the murder. I wish it would have let the player work out how to discover a certain secret for themselves instead of another character telling you, but I could see some players getting stuck with no idea how to progress, since it would be the only story part that would bar you from continuing before solving a puzzle. The trial had a nice mix of predictability and uncertainty, and made me look forward to where they would take the following trials, a big improvement from the first. Trial 3, on the other hand, was built on a rotten foundation, with the setup being so ridiculous that even with the explanation at the end of the game for how it was possible, I still think it pushes the ridiculousness way too far. It also doesn't help that there's some time-related issues regarding whether someone could have been in a certain place at a certain time. It's rather disappointing, because it had the possibility to be a good classic locked room puzzle. Trial 4 is probably the most complicated murder in the game, and one of its best. It can be confusing at times, but I think it works considering the setting where it takes place. The big mystery that the trial focuses around felt really cool to piece out. I also really liked the murderer's motivations, as it honestly felt the most in character compared to the rest, as it didn't have to rely on some new piece of information given during the trial that makes you see the murderer in a new light. However, it does have one pretty big and obvious plot hole that drags it down a little bit. However, I still thought that overall it was great. Trial 5 is the best trial in the game by a far margin. I honestly can't really think of anything bad to say about it. There was nothing that really stuck out to me. The motive is great and makes complete sense for the character. The sense of dread I felt as I realized how the murder had taken place was amazing, and the rather horrific nature of the crime really made for an amazing case. I would go as far to say that it's worth playing through the rest of the game for this trial alone, but I don't like to promote the idea that a small part of a game being brilliant makes up for the rest being lackluster. That's not to say that the other trials are, but Trial 6 certainly is. Trial 6 is, in my opinion, the worst trial in the game. Let me start off with the good about this trial, as there's not that much. I really liked the reveal of who a group of characters were, although I do wish there would have been a bit more of a build-up to it throughout the rest of the game. I also thought it was cool how the game mechanics were turned on their head a little bit near the end. I really like it when games take things that are already in place and reuse them in unique ways. Okay, now that we've gotten the few good things out of the way, let's talk about what's bad. The twist on where the students are is so lazy and ridiculous that the game acknowledges how ridiculous it is, which, although was quite funny, greatly undermines what mysteries should be taken seriously in future entries, as they could just as easily be hand-waved away. Why would I take anything seriously when you could just say it's like that? Because! Feels like they thought of things they wanted to happen but couldn't think of an interesting explanation, so just tack this onto the end with a singular hint near the start of the game. The surprise villain felt quite pointless and unnecessary as well, although the voice actor did a great job of giving them some character, so I honestly can't complain too much. And that's all the trials. It might not sound like a lot, but the trials are actually quite lengthy, so it's not a problem at all. Overall, the trials were pretty neatly divided into 3 groups, with 3 and 6 being atrocious, 1 and 2 being decent, and 4 and 5 being rather great. I guess there's also the overarching story of trying to escape the island, but it really doesn't have much presence after the first trial, and as I previously stated, the answers given by the final trial aren't all that satisfying. After completing the game, I should have felt mad, disappointed, embittered after the ending. But instead, I just laughed. At not just how ridiculous the ending was, but how ridiculous the game I just played was. And now we've reached the end of the review. And you may be thinking, well, what the hell, Jet? You just said that you liked the game, but you just spent the last 25 minutes tearing into it. And I do like the game. Obviously, I played the game pretty obsessively over the span of 4 days. But the more I think about the story, the more I think about each individual gameplay mechanic, the more I struggle to call Danganronpa 2 a good game. That's not to say I don't recommend the game. If you're into visual novels, anime, or just want a mystery game that doesn't take itself too seriously, I think you'll find a lot to love about it. The story at times can be a lot of fun, the characters, although most quite simple and basic, are wacky and have a certain charm to them. At least most of them do. It's not a masterpiece, it's not that smart, and it's not the best visual novel I've ever played. But if it's what you're into, it's certainly worth your time. So, hello, I'm Jetch, and I guess thanks for watching to the end of the video. To be completely honest, I'm not completely satisfied with this video. It has some problems with, for instance, I think the most glaring one is the inconsistent audio quality. I think I have it all figured out now, so it shouldn't be a problem in the future, but yeah, that was quite annoying. And I would have re-recorded it, but this video took too long to get out as it was. It should have been out like a month ago, but due to school and some other stuff, it just didn't get finished. And so there was also the scrap video I was planning on doing beforehand. Another issue that this video had is that I should have just went full spoiler, because that would have allowed me to show examples for things I was talking about during the video more often. As well as because when I was initially writing the review, I tried to avoid spoilers, but that was kind of fruitless. I also would have been able to talk more about the story, which would have been nice. The next video should be on Ghost Runner, and it'll be out in hopefully a month. No promises though. So yeah, thanks for watching. Bye.